Okay, hi, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the November issue of the Blue Thread. Really looking forward to this one. It's titled, as you can see, Can We Build a Resilient Water Sector? And it's the first time we've sort of bringing this to you in conjunction with the Future Water Association's Network November series of events, which has been looking at the whole water sector in 2024. And as we're towards the end of November, it's towards the end of that sort of series of events. So we'll be able to hear some of the outputs from those events as well. So that'll be really interesting. So just a quick few words from me around what we mean by resilience. When people say, you know, can we build a resilient water sector? The first question is, what is a resilient water sector? What does that mean? Is it resilient to everything the weather can throw at us? We've had some horrendous pictures from Valencia and, you know, multiple deaths, which because of flooding. We've also had some really terrible sort of events in Wales in the last weekend, in Pontypridd particularly, where we've had an awful lot of flooding as well. And the blame game continues as to, you know, the flood defences or what have you. But ultimately, are we looking at building a water sector or a water defences that are resilient to everything that the weather can throw at us, given climate change is going to make more extreme weather events even more common going forward? Or, you know, is it also being able to supply pharmaceutical grade water 24/7 under all conditions? You know, if we have severe drought, are we still expected to do that? Is that what resilient is? And then, you know, where do you go from there? Is it, you know, is it a question of governance? Is it a question of money? It's probably both. Is it a question of technology, data, IT, people? And just to give you an idea of what we're talking about here in terms of just the UK, you know, we have 400,000 kilometers of water mains. And if you think of them as not a continuous system, it's like probably 100,000 different hose pipes all joined together. So it's not surprising that there's a lot of sort of misconnections and leaks and all the rest. But 400,000 kilometers of water mains supplying 5 million properties. You know, I think we have 625,000 kilometers of sewers. Again, that's an awful lot all joined together. It's not a single system. It's many different systems, different ground conditions, what have you. And treating 16 billion liters of wastewater every day. So overall, what we'll try to address today is some of those answers, but also, is it actually possible? Can we build a resilient water sector, or do we actually need to accept some compromises along the way? But first, some housekeeping. So everybody's microphone is turned off. If you do, or please do, we encourage this, want to ask some questions, just type them into the question slot there, and I will get to them. We do try to answer as many of them as we possibly can. Sometimes we can't, but we will address them afterwards. We also have got social media. So if you want to just sort of let everyone know that you've attended this, let your colleagues, your friends know. We try to make this podcast technology interesting rather than tech heavy, so that you don't have to be an expert, you don't have to be a water sector professional to be able to enjoy it and learn from it. So, you know, spread the word. And also at the end of the podcast, you will get a survey into your inbox. I would very much encourage you to fill that out and let us know what worked, what didn't work, what other topics you'd like to see going forward, because this is something the Blue Thread is developing all the time, and we depend on you, our listeners, to help us develop it. So without any further ado, we've three very important and interesting guests to discuss today's discussion with us. So maybe they could come on screen. And first of all, we've got Jeff Darch. Delighted to have you, Jeff. Jeff is the head of strategic asset planning at Anglian Water, and is a non-exec director at Water Resources East as well. So we also have got Glenn Mountford, and Glenn is director of technical consulting at RSK Group. And of course, we have got Paul Horton, who is chief executive of the Future Water Association and has been on this Blue Thread a couple of times before. So, I mean, Paul, first of all, maybe you could start off by just telling people a little bit about the Network's November series of events. What have you held? You know, what are maybe 2 or 3 talking points that have come out of these? Because I know you've been doing this for the last 2 or 3 weeks, and I'm sure there's plenty of stuff that would be interesting to people listening here.
Sure, sure, Mark, and hello everyone. Well, for those that don't know, Networks November is the month we try and highlight, or aim to highlight, all things to do with pipes and sewers underground, and we see it's an important part of the outcomes of our report card, which we produced at the start of last year. So this year, across Networks November, we've looked at leakage and metering. We've looked at all things to do with EDI. We've been looking at development services, obviously Blue Thread's part of this mix as well, and we've been looking at standards, consistency of application and approach and understanding, and we're going to be at FloodX if anyone's coming to that this week. We've got well, a whole combination of things, including a water dragon session where we look at what's innovative and how quickly can we get innovations into the sector. We're looking at the delivery of AMP8. We've got a session on Friday looking at that. And we're also exploring where CSOs are in the whole debate and what that means in terms of data monitoring. And then we're going to try and bring that together with a session where, right, and on the 5th of December, which isn't November, but there's so much going on, Mark, that what we're looking at there is how, if you looked at all this in terms of risk register, what would the outputs be? And National Infrastructure Commission sharing that session with us. A quick snapshot of outputs. The 2022 drought and then the freeze thaw has impacted on leakage targets. It's going to be a struggle to meet them. The rollout of metering isn't happening fast enough, and the debate between whether they're smart or not is clouding the issue. The views across the month say they should all be AMI. Linked to all of this is we've been looking also at how the infrastructures such as reservoirs and others get planned and built, and how we move that forward and build the expertise with that. And in terms of EDI, the one that sort of slightly disappointed me, well, it has disappointed me, it's not slightly. We were moving ahead in terms of gender, ethnicity, disability, etc., and it feels and seems as though we've gone backwards on those now as a sector. Don't know the reasons for that, and hopefully we're going to explore them more in the coming next year. We're going to do a data report in that space. And you mentioned flooding. We don't need to talk about that again, do we? Because it's hitting the agenda in the UK, in Wales, in Spain, in other places. It's just reflecting the way the climate's changing. And I get fed up of talking about extremes now because extremes have become normal. So
I do feel that I feel a bit uncomfortable sometimes talking about flooding, because we talk about it in a sort of an academic sense, and yet there's people out there whose houses are ruined, as we speak. So, but ultimately, yeah. I think if we are going to build a resilient water sector, we have to pull together three things, as I see it. Right, we have to have infrastructure. Okay, we have to have world-class infrastructure. We have to have the ability to work with that infrastructure. We need the data, we need the systems to be able to interact with those, and then we need, of course, people. We need the people to build it, we need the people to maintain them, we need the people to operate them. And if you miss any one of those sort of points in the triangle, it doesn't work. And a question really, maybe go back to you, Paul. I mean, is it Future Water's opinion that given where we are today, we can build a resilient water sector?
Yes, I'll say that at the start.
Good. I mean, that's a good start, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a good start. I mean, and also, but I want to highlight a couple of things. I mean, Mark, you mentioned the 400,000 kilometres on water mains. You look at the gas industry. I think the gas industry has less than 270,000. So it's are in the water sector, and this is where we as an organisation have pulled together suppliers across the sector, constantly jump up and down and shout about data. People probably get bored with us now shouting about that, but it's data because that helps us maintain the infrastructure better. It's data because that helps us understand the infrastructure better. It's data as we need it. So if we're looking at things like CSOs and spills and event duration, then we need data. We need the monitors to be in the right place. We need that data to be analysed as often as we need it. Same with things like meters. We need to just come to a decision on where meters are placed and then look at the information that's coming through. look at the district metering areas and analyse those as we need to analyse them to get data on consumption, but also data on where leakage is occurring. And also, if you're looking at resilience, you need to be adaptable, and it's adaptable in a fixed infrastructure space. So the data again helps us look at all that information, you know, what's happening in the pumping stations, what's happening with the valves, you know, what can we do remotely, what do we need to have a constant view on. And that's the area where I think we're struggling as a sector, but it's an important part of resilience. So if you look at the world is in that zettabyte space. And for those who don't know what that is, 1 trillion gigabytes equals 1 zettabyte. And if you look at where we are as a sector, globally, we're only about 4%, 5% of data generation. Come back to the UK, it's the same. We're 4 to 5% of the data. The highest is healthcare, with telecoms, financials, energy, all above us. And they are the sectors you look at, and despite the problems they have, they appear to be sectors that are constantly adapting, changing, managing what they're having to deal with from an infrastructure viewpoint. They're better able to bring in their supply chain as needed, and they're better able to predict what's happening to their sector. So where do they need the next thing? Where do they need to look at? What are the gaps? Other sectors are better than in our space. So we need more information, and we need to be able to analyze that information and then look at what's coming next. Which of our infrastructure is prone to the challenge of climate change more than any other part of our infrastructure? What data do we need to help to analyze that? It's not just weather data, metering data. It's data around all aspects. And you mentioned people. We need more information on people. Who's coming into our sector? How long are they staying? What's our retention rate? All this sort of workforce issues that are hugely important. And then one of the things that energy is doing better than us is they're saying, this is our infrastructure that's at risk to the changing climate. And if this infrastructure fails, this is what it's going to cost us. And this needs to be part of how we assess ourselves going forward. We do a lot of
sorry, Paul, just to cut across you there. You started by saying yes,
yeah,
we can build a resilient water sector, and I'm still waiting for the bit that we're doing.
Okay,
so maybe we can park, because we'll come back to the data. But
yeah,
I'm really interested in particularly, like Jeff is sitting over there in Anglian Water over in the east, and you know, Anglian have been leaders really in adapting green infrastructure, grey infrastructure, you know, nature-based solutions. But Jeff, from your point of view, I started this podcast saying we need world-class infrastructure, and then of course, you know, obviously, where are we with that? I mean, it's got to be more than just big tanks capturing rain, hasn't it? So maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yes, I mean that is part of the solution, but I think it's that we need a diversity of options going into the future, and that will involve nature-based solutions, and that's indeed a big part of our kind of plans over the next sort of 5 to 10 years. Nature-based solutions are things that we've been kind of trialing. We know that they can deliver certain services, and you know they are very much kind of part of our thinking, and particularly when you start to look at the pressures that we've got on land and all of the other things that we, not just in the water sector actually, but more broadly, are trying to achieve. We've got to look at how we're kind of stacking the benefits of the way in which we're using land, whether that's for, you know, water improvements, whether that's for carbon, whether that's for restoring the natural environment. So that involves the water sector actually looking outward, you know, to work with other bodies, other sectors, in order to achieve our kind of common aims. But we can't do that on our own.
I think what's really interesting there is, you know, nature-based solutions has suddenly become the thing, right? Okay, everyone talks about nature-based solutions. In Anglian, you sort of have done some trials. You've worked with local landowners, and you've been doing work in the catchments as well. I'm like, where do you sit? I presume you don't see this as a silver bullet that'll solve everything, right? So I'm assuming it's part of it, you know, it's in the toolbox. So where do you sit? I guess also from your role in Water Resources East, you know, how important is this? How available is the land? How difficult is it? You know, could you tell us a little bit about your experiences with that, Jeff, please?
Yes, I mean, like I say, it's very much part of the toolkit. And I think that through the lessons that we've been learning over the past few years, we can kind of see the kind of the upsides of that, but also some of the risks associated with that. And I think that, you know, we kind of like to box things, don't we, into sort of it's grey or green infrastructure. And actually, there's the combination of those two things that I think, if you think about the new reservoirs that we're proposing in the region, yes, there's obviously a significant element of that which you might consider to be kind of hard infrastructure, but actually there's a lot of green infrastructure associated with what we're trying to achieve with that. And again, it's looking at the system. It's not just, you know, looking at the reservoir. It's looking at kind of how water can be moved through the landscape, how we can work with other partners to make sure they benefit from really a change in the water management regime, which you know, should provide multi benefits for you know, customers, but also for agriculture and nature.
So I think just again building on that, maybe coming to yourself, Glenn, because I know in WRC you spend a lot of time standing back and looking at the longer term, the strategic outcomes and stuff like that. You can't knock up a reservoir in 6 months, right? Okay, so obviously there's a lot of planning there, and AMP8 is starting to sort of have a look at these. But are we doing enough to manage and maintain our infrastructure for the future? Could we do more? How would we go about that from your point of view?
I think that's it's a really important point, Mark, in this whole question about resilience as a sector. And you know, my experience, every successive price review, of which I've been through far too many now, the number keeps sort of counting upwards, worrying when you sort of go, yeah, I'm approaching like my 5th price review in the industry. But each time it seems to get more and more complicated. There's more boxes to tick from the regulators, and I just wonder, you know, at what point there's perhaps a need to sort of stop and have a bit of a look and just say, are we missing some of the basics here in terms of, you know, an asset management plan? I think it's really fundamental to understand the asset condition as well as the performance, and actually, are we doing enough? Is it sustainable? What decisions need to be made? You know, there's always that sort of economic regulation or finance view of the world that is, you know, try and defer everything into the future, but are we just stacking too many problems on top of each other? I think is a concern, rather than saying, okay, we've got a long-term challenge here around leakage. You know, spreading that kind of extra bit of mains rehabilitation over and above what you need to do to stand still and maintain your current position, offsetting deterioration, doing a little bit extra every year, you know, that's a good way of managing the customer bill impact, that intergenerational fairness thing, rather than perhaps stacking things into, you know, that's somebody else's problem in the future. And I think too much of that's gone on. You might describe it as, you know, not fixing the roof while the sun's shining. I think, you know, we're perhaps starting to see. You
could equally say, Glenn, just to say, you know, are we building on foundations of sand here, right? So the complete logic of the 5-year plan was that you'd improve every 5 years and you'd build it up, right? Now, without going back and blaming, you know, who allocates blame for, I mean, essentially, do we need some radical changes? Do we need some radical thinking? Is there a different way of going about this, or are we in danger of just putting a tank at the end of a pipe, and in 2 years' time it's going to be too small anyway, so we have to make a bigger tank?
I think there's that is a challenge. I think it's one I've been sort of musing over. I think sometimes it can be quite a boring solution, and you know, that one I was just describing there, you know, perhaps doing an extra 0.2% of your network a year over 25 years, that's not really exciting. It's not going to hit the headlines, but you add all those 0.2% up and you're going to start eating into that problem over time. So I do wonder, is there a problem we've got? And this might be one for, it's human nature, probably not just as an industry, I think is a problem, but are we too good at rewarding sort of reactive behavior? It's really obvious when there's been a massive incident and everybody's pulled together. The vouchers go out, the pats on the back, the TV, however people get rewarded these days for supporting incidents. But are we not so good at recognising where, you know, long-term resilience has been improved, and how do you actually recognise that and reward it? Because it's those incidents that you manage to prevent, and they don't get rewarded in the same way, and they're not necessarily as exciting to talk about because they didn't happen. So is that kind of a fundamental challenge we've got to sort of get over as well? And there might be a human nature element to that as well, not just you know, technically doing things and how you regulate the sector, etc., but how do we actually sort of get to some of the, you know, reward for, you know, good decisions that were made in the past?
I mean that's the Y2K argument, isn't it? You know, did it ever happen? Would it have happened? Were we prepared for it? Did we stop it happening? And I guess, Jeff, you must come across this all the time. In you know, if you do the perfect job, nobody knows you exist, right? Okay, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and I often think about that in terms of kind of water supply. Nobody complains. Nobody even thinks about it until there's a problem. And to go back to the kind of theme of the webinar really around resilience, that's an interesting kind of point, because we've almost kind of got to a situation where customers, the public at large, don't have to think about resilience. You know, we've kind of almost sort of taken that problem away from them by kind of creating ever more kind of resilient systems. I mean, if you look at drought resilience, we're driving to a 1 in 500 year level of drought resilience, which, you know, means that we wouldn't pretty much never see a return to the kind of standpipes and stuff that we had in 1976, for example. Now that's great, and I'm not arguing against that, but it does mean that you know, the public at large, you know, assume that resilience is just an activity that others do on their behalf. And I think, you know, when we see the kind of flooding events now, and that kind of element around kind of the balance between kind of personal resilience, you know, property level resilience, catchment resilience, rather than, you know, just relying on the kind of the infrastructure built resilience is one that, you know, we need to discuss as a society.
And I guess, Paul, this brings into your honest conversation thing that I know you've been talking about for a long time, is essentially to get to the point of whatever is defined as a resilient water sector, you know, never be flooded, never have a lack of water, whatever that is. There's a need for a conversation here. Who's going to pay for it? How long will it take? Because if we are talking about putting a lot more supply in, you know, a lot more water into supply, we've also got to look at the demand side. Okay, so we can't keep going out at 150 litres per person per day. That's got to come down as well. I don't see that conversation happening. We had a general election. I didn't see it. We've now had a sort of series of sort of a new environment secretary, and I don't want to get into the price determination because that's coming out of Christmas. But do you feel that conversation is happening, Paul? And if not, how would you go about sort of triggering it, and what should happen?
Do we need the honest conversation? Absolutely. What does future water mean by that? It's not banding around the figures of, oh, 108 billion, oh, we spent this, oh, we've regulated that. It's the conversation that says, if we're looking at, for example, our assets properly, Jeff's mentioned infrastructure and pipelines and things, and Glenn's alluded to it. Well, the extra percentage that we need to do to increase the resilience of the infrastructure seems to be being missed. So we're talking currently about pipe networks and sewer networks meant to last the next 300-400 years, and even more on the sewer side. Well, so if that's reality, then how have we made that asset health assessment? What does that equal? Do we understand asset health properly? And this is where suppliers come in, because there's a lot of data being generated through the supply chain, but are we truly making an assessment on asset health, and how do we all see it? And that's where the honest conversation comes in, because that debate isn't happening much outside of the sector, and it needs to happen at the political level. And one example of this for me is that if we roll out, as we should, what's been termed smart metering, and that's metering that is the AMI meters, so you can automatically get meter readings, then that, in the information coming back from that, is going to tell us that we've either underestimated, overestimated, or didn't fully understand the per capita consumption. and that's the target in the next AMP period. And it's also going to say, oh, if the meters are running at this rate, then chances are there's a leak. The leak could be on the customer side, it could be on the main side that the utilities look after. So we find more leaks, brilliant. We need to be aware of where they are. The next question back to asset health is that, well, what do we do about that? Are we in that position where we can go out and mend leaks faster, become more innovative in how we drive that approach? And it all ties in on the certainly on the main side and sewer side, Mark. It all ties into the fact that there's more rainwater going into the drains. There's more rain at the moment coming off and going into our river systems, and there's greater demand. So we're having to manage all of this when everything's changing, which brings in Jeff's point around people, land. It brings in the whole wider environment. And that's the question. If we're not having the honest conversation, then we're not properly looking at all of this as an interconnected system, which is what we need to do, and that benefits everyone, including the suppliers.
I guess, Glenn, maybe you could talk a little bit about this. I mean, this is the whole systems-based thinking thing that I know WRC have been doing quite a bit on, and equally, I think the whole idea of trying to fix the bike while you're riding the bike, and ultimately, you can go into a sort of a somewhat of despair quite quickly. But maybe you can take us out of that and follow on from Paul's initial point that yes, we can build a resilient water sector, and maybe talk a little bit about how you would want to see systems-based thinking incorporated in some of these decisions.
I think it's a really interesting one to sort of look at and think about, and I'll sort of probably go back to some of my sort of more operational days in the sort of water company, where I think what kind of motivated me, and it was partly, I suppose, the pain and hassle when being in a sort of a relatively small water company when things went wrong and you suddenly saw the collection of people building at about 10 to 5 and you were like, oh no, an incident's kicking off and it's going to be a late one. And that was, I suppose, part of the the personal motivation for trying to build more resilient systems. But I think what I suppose I learned over time was you can spend a lot of money on your infrastructure and your non-infrastructure, but unless you're really challenging yourself to think about how it operates and how it might be needed to operate, then that thinking was key. And time again, I saw perceptions challenged, and often it would come down to somebody in a certain position being particularly awkward. I'll give an example. One of the things I used to be responsible for was the strategic control valves, so not your distribution networks, but trunk main control valves. And being responsible for getting those brought up to a decent specification and standard. And often it would be some awkward so-and-so would be saying, you can't have an outage for that, we can't cope with it, we need to make sure there's alternative supplies and all the rest of it. And we ended up actually in some cases bringing in, upgrading probably a couple of old emergency PRVs that were, the antiquated ones with like weights on and things like that, getting them up to sort of 21st century standards. And maybe then sort of years down the line, then some of those emergency valves that we spent, a pittance on in comparison to how much we spent on the overall system as a whole in terms of mains rehab and treatment and all the other things. A really small amount of money actually greatly improved the resilience of those systems, because we didn't just sort of sit there and look at resilience in terms of corporate resilience and all of these other things that you might think about. We actually looked at it in terms of how does that operate as a system? How can we use the models and test and challenge some of that, and then actually do something about it? And it was relatively small spend, but it did have a fundamental difference. And I think I'm really interested to sort of see how. Back to some of the, won't say too much on the regulation bit, but are we just heading into a world where some of that creativity just ends up being stifled because we've got so many boxes to tick with, price control deliverables and outcomes and all the rest of it, that you're actually sort of putting too many shackles on companies to not be able to look at the system and think, actually we've got some really critical sort of risks and issues there as it stands, and how could we perhaps do things a little bit differently?
I mean, what's interesting there, Glenn, is regulators regulate, right? Okay, and when you want to regulate, you want box ticks, right? But I think equally, maybe Jeff, you could pick this. you know, do we need a vision? I mean, you sit on the water resource WRE, right? Okay, so that's a 25-year water resources plan for East Anglia or the East of England, and then you work for Anglian Water, who work to 5-year plans. You know, Glenn is just talking about a lack of joined up thinking within a small water company. I'm like, how do you find at a regional level, and how would you know, how would we go about that to actually say bring the public into those discussions? And I know there are various collaborative forums and stuff like that, but where do you sit in this one?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've got to think about the 5-year plan in the context of 25 years as much as we possibly can. There's a good example of this that in the water resources space at the moment, where we've got this concept of environmental destination. So rather than looking at what abstraction changes we need on a year by year or AMP by AMP basis, we're actually saying what do we think the environment might need in 2050, and then kind of working back from there. So I think that kind of approach, we need to address other things. I mean, you know, the asset health thing would be an absolutely great example of that. You know, what do we want our assets to look like and feel like in 2050, and therefore what's the incremental change that we need to start making over the next 2 decades or so. So I think that's really important. I think that the public conversation is a really interesting one, and really we've got to kind of consider sort of what does resilience mean, I think, for a public over those kind of longer time scales. You know, can we get to a situation where it's sensible that publics don't think about resilience, or actually do we need to, you know, have a conversation with publics that enables a bit more of a partnership approach to resilience? And I think other countries have been a lot smarter at this. You know, they've been necessitated to do so. But if you think about the response to wildfires, the response to droughts in other countries, there's a much greater awareness of these kind of natural events, and therefore people have an understanding, and not just individuals but also in communities. You know, community fire wardens, you know, things like that. People take some additional kind of responsibility for you know, for adapting to these kind of events. So yeah, I think it's a tough one, I think, particularly in the current political sort of climate. But actually, I think if we're going to get to a sort of better solution overall, we've got to start having some of those conversations.
I think it is interesting because you know, I lived in America for a couple of years, and in Pennsylvania, they, you know, when it snows, the neighborhood clears the hydrants. You know, they have the standing up hydrants, right? So they do that. The other thing they do is when in autumn when all the leaves come off, the sort of neighbors clear the drains, right? Okay. Now they don't expect somebody else to do it; they do it, and this is all done through sort of neighborhood volunteering and schools and all that sort of thing. It's something that perhaps we could learn a bit more from there, I think, maybe. I mean, Paul, you started with data, and I'd like to pick at the data a little bit, because I quite often hear in my travels, you know, we need more data, we need AI. Fine, that's great. So maybe we could talk a little about data, and then maybe Glenn, I know you could come in and talk, because you've got some concerns around, you know, cybersecurity and stuff like that. One of the best protections from cybersecurity is not to have joined up systems. So perhaps that's a good protection where we are at the moment. But if we do get more advanced, maybe that brings other risks with it. So maybe, Paul, you can start with, you know, how you see data, because ultimately we have fixed assets that are in the ground for 100 years, right? And they convey water, and that's going to be part of whatever resilience solution we come up with. But they are fairly dumb assets at the moment, right? Okay, so how do we upgrade those assets? And then Glenn, as I said, you could come in and talk a little bit about the security. So, Paul.
Yeah, so I think data is critical, especially when you look, you know, as I mentioned earlier, compared to other sectors that are doing more, that understand more about what's going on with the you know, in the sectors that they're in. We are low down on the list, so that's the first thing. Do we know, I mean, you mentioned the figures earlier on, do we know where all our pipe networks are and where all our drains and sewers are? No, is the answer. So, you know, that's the first thing. If we're going to get smarter in this space, then, I mean, Glenn's alluded to, you know, pipe replacement rates. Why don't we replace the pipes and, as a minimum, tag them? You know, note the material, where they've been laid in the ground, etc. Map it. We can do all of that now, and make pipes with very clever things built into the material, so we know where they are and we can keep a constant eye on them. The same with meters as well. Just make sure everything going forward is the latest it can be, and it's recorded, and we understand the asset, and we understand the asset life, and therefore when it needs to be looked at again. All of this forms part of resilience and what resilience equals. The 2022 summer highlighted how much ground moves underneath pipes. So do we have all that information now? We've got a lot of it. Have we analysed it? Not properly. So if we're going to become resilience to me equals being able to be adaptable. So it's resilience means not just being able to cope with the situation, and we managed to get through it, but it means being able to adapt to a situation. So no matter what is thrown at you, you can adapt, and that is a critical challenge. Encourage and work with the supply chain to make sure every asset is logged. And you know, Glenn alluded to valves. I could say the same with things like leak noise monitors. I could say the same, you know, with pipe couplings. You know, a whole range of things. Once you have all that information, and you can start using it in a much better way, and you can drive your maintenance program in a very adaptable way. We know that X and Y is going to happen, therefore we know we need to look at all of the assets in this space because they're going to be prone to the next flood, the next drought, etc. It allows much more flexibility, and as Jeff's alluded to, it allows you to say, do you know what, we have to manage who, you know, which organisations come into our area that may be major water users, and we can manage how they come in, and we can manage the amount of water that we supply to those organisations. The data creates that adaptability. With things like AI now, Mark, is for me, use AI to help plug the data gaps. Don't use it to run things, and we're not at that stage, but we are at the stage where we need to start collecting more information and being able to analyse it, and there's a space for AI there. But I do appreciate that, you know, we're pushing the boundaries with all of this in our sector, whilst other sectors are way ahead. But I think, as you're going to ask Glenn, there's a lot of challenges around our data information, data security, and again, that's an area we need to be adaptable to.
Glenn, maybe you can pick that up.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting topic, a very, you know, highly evolving one as well as the sector changes. And you know, start off with this sort of you know, amusement at home where the kids will come in and, you know, tell me, you know, I don't know what I'm doing in terms of computing, and it's like, yeah, kids, I've like grown up sort of coding on BBC micros and been through the sort of 1980s 8-bit era, you know, to this very day, and use it, you know, most of the day at work as well. So it's like, thanks kids, you know. But I think it's amazing when you think about that sort of journey, and I go back to the sort of 2000s and, you know, what it was like in terms of water companies. And yes, there was telemetry in place on, you know, the big assets, but networks had very little in those days. You know, it was only the sort of infancy of mobile phones becoming affordable technology, and everything was manually collected pretty much on the network side of things. And a big part of my early career was then, you know, getting things upgraded, and we went from having, you know, a 3-week download cycle on DMA data to suddenly daily data to hourly data to half-hourly data, and now you can have as much data as you want, and pressure transients and water quality and acoustic data. It's phenomenal, the, you know, the potential that sort of has brought in terms of efficiency and the ability to sort of understand and visualize what's happening on a kind of a near real-time basis across water networks. But then you do start to think, you know, the world does seem to be sort of going through a sort of a phase of change. You know, the geopolitical landscape is one aspect that, you know, we need to think about. Russia, China, what does that bring? It's easy, I think, it'd be easy to say, well, that's government's problem, it's the MOD, it's the IT department, you know, it's their issue to worry about. But I think personally there's an onus on everybody in, you know, the sector really. If you're managing water networks, for instance, to actually just stop and think, yeah, what would we actually do, you know, in terms of even if, let's take out of the equation some of the, very low probability, the internet's broken for long term. Yes, it could happen. Undersea cables could be cut en masse or something like that. But let's just say it got to a point where it wasn't as reliable as we used to. We're very much reliant on technology today. We're very used to picking up the mobile phone and it working. But let's say that reliability was severely diminished to the point we didn't really trust it as much. So what's our plan B? And I think really important, I think, for the industry to just think, okay, if it didn't have, that communications network, how would we go about doing things? And I think there might be some small steps that this isn't about spending tons of money on IT security. I think it's just make sure when you're procuring things that you're thinking about the end-to-end process. Can you download data manually? Can you get that manual data into the corporate system? And I think those sorts of steps would be quite important to just have the ability, have the knowledge of how would you do it, test that out, do it in practice and say, right, we're going to imagine it, we've lost every bit of network data, and we're going to try and manage that system for a day without it. I think those sorts of exercises would be really, really key as well, that people sort of operationally stop and think about these as well. And emergency planning teams and departments, I think, have got clearly a role to play, and I think it's just making sure as a sector, are we doing enough of those things? Perhaps they form part of the multi-agency, tests that get carried out where all the different stakeholders, the military and the police and everybody else comes in. I think you could do those sorts of events, but also just for companies to sort of stop and challenge themselves and say, what would we actually do? Could we get data from A to B in a more manual way, which might not be ideal? We've got a DMA over there that's full of acoustic sensors. Have we actually got a box full of good old-fashioned listening sticks that we could deploy in place of? And what are the plan Bs? And how would you sort of mitigate some of those? Not necessarily fully, but at least partially. So I think with those cybersecurity, it's easy to just sort of put it all on government and IT departments and say that's that dealt with. But we have become increasingly reliant on technology, and I think it's just sort of playing those sort of things through and saying, what does the ideal workforce look like? Is it resilient to have no technicians and 100% smart sensors and AI, or actually are we opening ourselves up there to a problem where a hybrid might be better because the human eye is very good at detecting anomalies and dealing with a lot of things that are a bit too tricky for automation and control type situations to deal with. So I think what are we aiming for? I think that's where the leadership piece is key as well, to say what is a resilient workforce? Is it that happy medium between the two?
Interesting, because you brought in the workforce there. I mean, when I joined in the 90s, it's all chemical civil engineers and the odd biologist, microbiologist, and limnologist. I've never really found out what they do, but anyway, they're usually around. But nowadays, of course, there's vastly wider skill sets needed, and I guess maybe, Jeff, the quality of staff in the water sector, I've always found are really, really good. The people I've worked with over many, many years, it's a real success story. However, I think it's a fact of matter that a lot of us are now sort of towards the more towards the end of our careers than towards the start of the career. And how are you finding that within Anglian Water? Sort of, do you struggle to recruit people? Do you still have lots of people, or how is that going? And where do you think those people are best deployed? Because the one thing I'm absolutely sure is that we can't go 100% dependent on sensors. We need people as well, so we need trained people. So maybe that's another thing you could talk a little bit about is training people. So Jeff.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah, and I think to your point, it's all very well, having millions of sensors, trillions of data points, and all the rest of it, but we're a long way from AI, as Paul has noted, being able to kind of solve the problems for us, and we can go and put our feet up. We are still going to have to be asking the relevant questions. We're going to have to be training the models if we're using models, and so on and so on. So people are absolutely critical to any organization in the sector, whether that's a water company or indeed in the supply chain as well. And I think it's very healthy that we now have quite a diverse workforce in terms of sort of technical planning. As has been noted from Paul, I think we've got further to go looking at EDI more generally, and that will only be for the better as well. And I think in terms of I think the water industry is still an attractive place to work for people. I think obviously the current situation it makes that a little bit more complicated. But I think when people kind of understand what it is we're doing, and the fact that we're quite purpose-led as organizations, we are about the provision of clean, safe drinking water, about the protection of the environment, and it still is an attractive place and destination for people to work in, and we absolutely need that. If you look at the infrastructure requirements that we've got coming up over the next decade or so, we need a lot more people than that we have at the moment, and we need good quality people as well. So yeah, definitely challenges, but I think that there's enough optimism that the water industry will still be a very bright place to be part of.
Thanks, Jeff. And yeah, Paul, you mentioned at the start in your introductory comments, about going backwards a little bit in EDI, equality, diversity, and inclusion. I mean, I don't want to go at that too deep because I think that's quite a big topic, but it's something Future Water have been concerned about for a long time. Is that loss of talent? I don't know what percentage of people are going to retire in the next 5 years, but it's a lot. I know that. So, yes. I mean, are you hearing the same story that Jeff is talking about here?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the sector now, it's much more. I use the word open, but what I mean by that is that the days when people thought, oh, I need to be a civil engineer or chemical engineer or mechanical engineer, actually the sector saying we need people from a huge number of backgrounds. They can be ecologists, they can be HR, they can be science, they can be just the range of backgrounds is huge, and that's massively important. What needs to happen a lot more is a conversation, and a conversation about what the sector is, what the sector needs, and that purpose and ethics that Jeff alluded to, which is there. Whatever the press says, there's a huge amount of purpose in the sector. But I also think at the same time, we've got to look towards other sectors where if you look at somebody like the nuclear sector, they've done a huge amount over 2 or 3 decades on what they call corporate knowledge retention, and the experiences and knowledge and everything that people have got been able to be captured and passed on to the next group of people. And Glenn alluded to this, which gives you the resilience in terms of systems going down. People understand how networks operate and pumping stations, and so that level of knowledge is great. If a system goes down, it takes out the AI. But I think we need to be more adaptable in that it's not anymore for as we see it, Future Water, about going out and saying, hey, we got these great jobs and just doing the usual advertising. I think it's looking at all the clever organizations that are able to get a combination of the right people in, know which media to use to talk to potential candidates going forward, and recognize that much greater flexibility. Where going forward, we won't have people in the sector for 30 years in the same way that we have had. They'll be changing jobs, changing roles, going out of the sector and coming back into the sector. So that level of understanding of the flexible nature going forward needs to be built in. And then, Mark, I would throw in if you look at the fact we're going to build the reservoirs Jeff alluded to, and water transfer schemes, they don't happen overnight. They require a different skill set. They require people who perhaps a combination have done it before, understand how it's done, understand how all these things are maintained. So we actually need a wider group of people in the sector going forward.
I think that, I mean, first of all, those reservoirs aren't just alluded to by Jeff, they're actually in the business plans. So I think some of them will be actually built. My worry about them, and I think this is coming through in the questions, and we'll come to some questions now, is it'll take 20 to 30 years to get one of these up and built, operational, and all the rest of it. And I think just to sort of, when I read the questions, and we've had quite a few here, a lot of them are about what can be done now. And I guess maybe I could throw that one to you first, Jeff. What can be done urgently and radically to make the necessary changes to ensure our water is kept clean and secure for now and future generations? And I guess that's the sort of thought process of, okay, this is great, but water is obviously, we need to think in longer terms. But what can be done, if anything, urgently and radically?
Yeah, and I think there are things that we can do, and you know, it's going to be a decade and more before we get the first reservoir, you know, producing water, and 2040 by the second. So the key thing really is demand management. And I know this is probably the kind of less exciting side of the coin in some ways, but it's absolutely something that's in all of our collective control to do more on. And that includes obviously things like, you know, reducing leakage further. But what we're seeing, you know, we've got 1 million smart meters in the ground. We're seeing really positive results off the back of that in terms of the reduction
Do you
in
find it
both.
driving down? Do you find the smart meter in the ground drives down
Yes,
consumption, Jeff?
yes, exactly. Both in
Knowledge is power. Yeah.
we are exactly, yeah, and a lot of it's unintended consumption. This is leaks within people's homes and businesses that they just didn't know they had. And we're able to point those out, and people are fixing them. They're taking it responsibly. And you know, we talked a little bit about per capita consumption earlier. You know, our smart meter customers are less than 120 liters per head per day. So that's kind of really positive. And you know, there's more to go out there. So I think, you know, in terms of sort of heading towards 110 as a very long-term goal, I think we can see a pathway to that. I think we now got to look at things like efficiency in businesses, in industry, and the other thing which I'm doing quite a bit of work on at the minute is looking at alternative sources of water. You know, you know, as an industry, we put out something like 10 billion liters of absolute top quality water, the best drinking water quality in the world, and a third of that we just flush down the toilet. You know, is that sensible in the 21st century or not? Well, we've got to start looking more seriously about dual source of supply, at least into new properties. And you can look at the whole reuse question, you know, for industry and other areas as well. I think we've got to be a lot smarter at matching the sources of water with the uses of water.
As a quick question, Jeff, you know, smart meter less than 120 liters per head per day. What about a dumb meter? Do you have that data?
Yeah, so a standard meter that is measured and that'll be typically 6 to 12 months is more like 128 liters per head per day. If you're not metered in our region, you're using around 165 liters per head per day. So you can see some really big differences. And
I often think with 60 million people, if we all saved 1 liter, that's 60 megaliters. Without really any effort, isn't it? Really, I know that's very basic, isn't it? But you know, it's sort of
yeah. And to the point on the continuous flow, Mark, when we connect a smart meter, around 10 to 11% of properties have a continuous flow, and it's quite easy to have a continuous flow of 300 to 400 liters per property per day. That's not even consumption we're trying to use. We've got to eliminate that for starters.
So another question, Glenn, one for you. I know you like this one. I won't read it all, but it's about essentially Ofwat advising a sustainable replacement rate of about 0.8%. The AMP8 plan, the ones that are in the business plans, is looking at a 0.2 to 0.4% replacement. So the question is, inevitably, asset condition is deteriorating over time. What do we do about that, or how does that fit into this resilient conversation as well?
I think for me, Mark, it's sort of twofold. We can sit and sort of, you know, we've seen a bit of a shift at PR24 towards more of that sort of long-term thinking, need to invest, etc. But I think, are we at the right level? And I think that's where it's probably got to be on both sides of the table. I think, to be fair, I think we need to sort of perhaps get out of this cycle where, I'll include the agency in this as well, EA and NRW. You know, there's a big list, there's a big to-do list comes out of the WRMP, the DWMP process, regional planning, on top of the business planning. It's, you know, there's a lot to go at there. So where does the assets come into the asset management plan, I think, is key. You know, that's just one thing to sort of say, let's actually get back to basics. Let's make sure they are the focus in terms of planning, and that the regulators are mindful of that. You know, put too many distractions in place, and you know, it's not necessarily helping paint that clear picture in terms of the state of the industry and the state of individual companies and how individual companies are performing, how they're deteriorating. So I think let's actually try and get some of that back into the strategic planning process will be a good start. But also I think the companies, you know, don't have to sort of sit and wait for the regulator to tell them what to do. You know, they're closest to their assets. They can gather that evidence and create that compelling case to make to the regulators and convince the general public of the need as well in terms of what's right, what's the right pace and scale. And, you know, there's a lot of stuff around intergenerational fairness to think about as well, you know, who pays and who benefits, all of that good stuff. But fundamentally, you know, actually sort of making sure there's enough evidence there. You know, we sort of go back a couple of decades, there was a lot of data available on asset condition, and then, you know, that the world sort of moved on, and there's a lot of focus on performance, but, you know, at the moment, PR24, some of the asset condition data sets are really asset performance in terms of burst frequency per kilometre, rather than saying, yes, we've got some kind of physical measure of, you know, pipe wall thickness, etc. And I'm not saying we should, you know, create a system here where we go around and collect a ton of that kind of physical data. You know, much as I'd like to say that, I just don't think it'd be good value. But I think where there are, you know, there's an evidence base needed as well to understand certainly the parts of the network that you're asking for significant sums of money to do something about. I think that does play a key part of that.
I think that whole concept of understanding the risk pinch points and maintaining and managing and upgrading those risk pinch points is really, really important. And you know, critical assessment, criticality, you know, you don't have to replace every inch of every pipe. But you do have to replace certain bits of it, and the most important bit of that is which, you know, you need to know which bits needs to be replaced, you know, and I think that's the bit that we perhaps have dropped the ball a little bit on in the last decade or so.
I think a really important point to make there, Mark, would be just the sort of mentality, and this is sort of how you approach that sort of problem. And for me, it's about the kind of total cost there. If you've got almost a mains rehabilitation budget over there and somebody else is dealing with asset condition data or inspection data over in a different sort of team or something like that, it doesn't help if you look at those as separate things. You know, if you do no inspection, you could turn up and go, right, we'll do a whole mains rehab program on burst history, replace all of these assets, and find, you know, actually you didn't need to replace some of it and you've learned that afterwards. Or you can sort of perhaps go in and do a bit more inspection up front and have a more targeted approach to rehabilitation, which might represent better value. And I think it's almost that economic level of inspection that you look at the cost of the rehab and the cost of the inspection, and you put it all together and sort of try and deliver best value for society, customers, and the environment.
I feel another spreadsheet coming on, Glenn. I'm not sure that's what we need, but final question to you, Paul, is really interesting one actually. Is how can the water industry help ensure that industrial practices adopt cleaner processes that align with a net zero future while addressing legacy issues of contamination? And I guess this all comes to the fact that we're fixing the bike as we ride it. We have targets for net zero carbon 2030, 2035. Ultimately, everything we do going forward has to hit that. So do you feel that's happening? Do you feel we've lost sight of the carbon? I've been grossly disappointed about what's happened in COP last week. The one in Colombia before that was not too good either. Where are you in this world? Is the water sector taking its eye off the carbon ball or not?
I don't think the sector's taken its eye off the ball, Mark. I think the sector's found how difficult it is. You know, we do need to recognise that the sector's not operating to sort of globally recognised standards. So the sector's operating to the standards as it sees fit per company, in terms of baseline measurements, in terms of baselines where they've got detailed measurements. So it's a good starting point. Looking at what Glenn's just highlighted, if you go with someone like Germany, they're replacing 2% of their network every sort of equivalent investment period. Does that make sense? How do you replace that network in the least carbon way? You know, we're talking about trenchless technology and other systems, potentially robotics going forward. I think the sector's driving as much, or beginning to drive as much energy output as it can from treatment systems, and I think that's a positive step forward. When you get into the rest of the discussion around carbon and understanding carbon in all products and services, including things like fleet management, getting to and from work, what the suppliers are doing. I think there's a real challenge there. Obviously, during the first 2 years of the current COVID meant you couldn't, in theory, you couldn't have 2 people in a van, so you had to have two vans going to site and things, and so we lost things there. And I think carbon's reduction isn't necessarily cheap, so there's a cost implication to the water companies in driving that reduction. I know, for example, Jeff's company, Anglian, say they won't do offsetting. So what they will do is they'll drive carbon reduction rather than just say, oh, we've built this, planted loads of trees. And because the person, if he's still there, Jeff, David Riley's told me that he doesn't believe it's the right way going. It doesn't drive carbon reduction properly. So there's a whole area there, and then you've got the systems approach. Are we integrating both the water and wastewater the way that we should in terms of supply, treatment, etc., in terms of the whole?
So I mean, we could go on forever. It's been a fantastic conversation. I'm gonna have to bring it to a halt because we have a hard stop. I think ultimately, you know, I feel a bit positive. You know, you started off saying, yes, we can build a resilient water sector, and then you talked for 10 minutes about why we can't, but then the rest of the conversation actually has been about how we can. I think I just want to say that, you know, we in the Blue Thread next year, we'll be doing a nature-based solutions masterclass. We'll be looking at process emissions, we'll be looking at carbon. So, you know, keep listening, keep developing these themes and the conversations. But it just want to thank Jeff, Glenn and Paul for a fantastic conversation. Thanks to everybody for all the great questions. Sorry, I didn't get to them all, but I think we covered the vast majority of them. So that's it. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.